Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out and joining us on this webinar. My name is Jeffrey Veidlinger, and I'm the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute here at the University of Michigan. Welcome to this afternoon's Samantha Woll Dialogue. This afternoon, we will be asking the broad question, is there a path forward? And we've brought together two scholars who will give two views from the Gaza border. So first of all, thank you again to all of you who are joining us this afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever you are from around the globe, and particularly welcome to those who are enrolled in the Wallenberg Institute's course on the world after October 7th. I know that you should all be here right now. And thank you as well to the staff of the Wallenberg Institute, Miriam Mora, Eleanor Camp, Alexis Gideon, and Joe Johnson. This series honors the memory of Samantha Woll, a passionate community leader and Michigan graduate who advocated for women's rights, labor rights, civil rights, refugee rights, the state of Israel, and building bridges across religious, ethnic, political, and community groups. Among her many accomplishments was the foundation of the Muslim-Jewish Forum in Detroit in 2015. Samantha was murdered at the age of 40 in October 2023 while serving as president of the Isaac Agree Synagogue in downtown Detroit. I'm grateful to her family for establishing this series in her honor. Part of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's public programming, the Samantha Woll Dialogues address difficult topics suitable to the challenges of our era, with an emphasis on the Wallenberg's mission of studying and combating ethnic and religious hatred, fostering cross-cultural understanding, elevating civil discourse, and developing strategies to fight anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination of all kinds. These values are inspired by the person of Raoul Wallenberg, a University of Michigan graduate from 1935 who went on to save thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust by handing out protective papers from his native Sweden on behalf of the American War Refugee Board. Wallenberg was arrested by the Red Army and perished in a Soviet prison. In 1981, he became the second person ever to be named an honorary citizen of the United States after Winston Churchill, and to date, only 8 individuals have received this honor. I recognize that today's topic is a difficult one. Continuing violence in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Israel, Iran, and elsewhere around the Middle East resonate here in America and on campus as well as around the world. Many of us are hurting, including, I'm sure, our two guests today. So let me begin by thanking them profoundly for agreeing to come together to talk to each other. We'd planned on holding this event in person. I really believe in person-to-person communication, particularly on sensitive matters like this. But the partial closure of Israeli airspace made travel for Jonathan impossible, despite heroic attempts to get him here. And Mkhaimar similarly was willing to endure 10-hour airport layovers to get here from Cairo, but in the end, it just wasn't possible to convene in person. It's a testament, though, to our speakers' bravery and commitment to dialogue that we are still here today, despite everything that has happened since we first extended this invitation some months ago. So let me now introduce our speakers and we'll get to the program. So first, Jonathan Dekel-Chen is the Rabbi Edward Sandrau Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he holds dual appointments in the Department of Jewish History and the Department of General History. Professor Dekel-Chen is also the academic chairman of the Leonid Nevlin Research Center for Russian and East European Jewry. His research and publications deal with transnational philanthropy and advocacy, informal diplomacy, agrarian history, and migration. Jonathan is also a member of Kibbutz Nir Oz, one of the communities attacked by Hamas on October 7th, 2023. His 37-year-old son, Sagui, a father of 3 young girls, was among the hostages taken from Nir Oz. Sagui was released in February 2025 after 498 days in captivity. Since the Hamas attack on his kibbutz, Jonathan has advocated in the US and Israel for release of the hostages, including many meetings with senior officials in both the Biden and Trump administrations, as well as members of Congress. He's also made hundreds of media appearances to inform the public about the plight of the hostages and has worked tirelessly for the mission of peace, a mission that really he's been involved in his whole life. And in full disclosure, I want to add that I have been colleagues and friends with Jonathan for several decades. He's hosted me at his center in Jerusalem more times than I can count, and we collaborated on a major research project on the history of migration. I have long admired his work and continue to admire his work, and now also his work on behalf of peace. Mkhaimar Abusada, our other speaker, is a US-educated expert on Palestinian politics and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He received his PhD from the University of Missouri-Columbia in 1996 and is an associate professor of political science at Al-Azhar University of Gaza and the former chair of the university's political science department. He served as a visiting lecturer at Northwestern University in 2024 and 2025, and he's authored one book and many academic articles in local and internationally recognized academic journals. He's also written for Project Syndicate, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and The Conversation. Professor Abusada was also in Gaza at the beginning of the war and evacuated to Khan Yunis in the south, from where he was able to make it to Cairo thanks to the intervention of the American embassy. His commitment to peaceful dialogue has been evident in the numerous interviews he's given and his public activity since October 7th. And I've got to imagine many of those at great risk to himself. Mkhaimar, it's an honor to meet you, and thank you for coming as well. I'd like to note that I actually did the math here. Kibbutz Nir Oz is located about 20 kilometers or 12 miles from the University of Al-Azhar in Gaza. The two of you are neighbors. I understand that you've never met before, and I'm glad that we're giving you this opportunity to meet in person. And I'm hoping today that we can talk about what your neighborhood has undergone over the last couple of years, what it looks like today, and what you see, what visions you have for the future of the neighborhood that you both share. I'd like to begin our conversation by asking each of you to talk a bit about your personal backgrounds and your experiences over the last 2.5 years. So maybe starting with Mkhaimar, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about what the last 2.5 years have been like for you.
Well, many thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, it's also a pleasure to be with Jonathan. Yes, this event was supposed to be an in-person event, but unfortunately, due to the circumstances going on in the region, it did not happen. Let me also thank the Raoul Wallenberg Center for hosting this event between me and Jonathan. Speaking of myself, as you introduced me, Jeff, my name is Mkhaimar Abusada. I'm an associate professor of political science at Al-Azhar University of Gaza. I was born and raised in Gaza and spent most of my life in Gaza, except those years that I spent in the US when I was doing my graduate studies. My family, my parents were originally from Mandate, Palestine. They were expelled or fled from Mandate, Palestine in 1948. I was born in the Jabalia refugee camp. But let me say one little note here that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the Israel-Palestine conflict did not start on October 7. This conflict has been going on for about 78 years now. When Israel was established on May 15 of 1948, and that for the Palestinians is the start of the so-called Palestinian Nakba or the Palestinian catastrophe, where two-thirds of the Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes, towns, and villages in Mandate Palestine, and they became refugees scattered in the neighboring Arab countries, mainly Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and also part of those Palestinian refugees, like my family, ended up in the Gaza Strip and also others in the West Bank. I have to say that it's been a very traumatic 2.5 years for me. First of all, let me say that at the beginning of after October 7 and the early days of the war, namely on October 29th of 2023, I lost two nephews and their mother, and also their three little children who barely were something between the age of 6 and 8. In total, I lost 25 people of my Abusada family were basically were killed during this war between October 7th and until the ceasefire. In addition to the death and suffering and also displacement for myself and my family and many of my relatives, it also it's been a very difficult time that I always say to my kids and my wife, probably we will never be again all together in one place, as we have lived in Gaza for as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Gaza, and all of my kids, I have 5 kids, 3 boys and 2 girls, and the eldest is 31 and the youngest, she's 18. And nowadays, we are not all together. One of my sons is in Qatar, another son is in the US, the rest of us here in Cairo. But it seems to me that as a result of the war and as a result of the destruction that was inflicted on Gaza in the past 2.5 years, unfortunately, life will never be the same, and we will probably not be able to live as a family together. I hope that would happen one day, but it seems to me that it's going to be very far away from here. Now, if I'm supposed to speak about the future, I can go on with that, Jeff, or you want me to stop here and allow my colleague Jonathan to go and introduce himself?
Yeah, let's hold off on the future, and I'll have Jonathan. I'm really sorry to hear about your experiences and to hear about what the last few years have been like for you. I can't imagine what you've gone through, and appreciate your willingness to talk about it.
Thank you.
Jonathan, same to you. I know a little bit more about what you've gone through, but why don't you share it with the audience?
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you and the Wallenberg Institute for being willing to convene this conversation. You know, there's both before and after October 7th, way too much hate and way too little preparedness for peacemaking. And I keenly am aware of the courage that it takes to expose oneself as a peacemaker, particularly in times like this, where the odds are against you. So I applaud the Wallenberg Center for being willing to convene. Again, I too wish it was in person. And Mkhaimar, I applaud you. You know, I've been on a battlefield, so I know what that's like in terms of what it takes. But for you to be with us today it shows an immense amount of moral courage. So thank you for being here, and I hope that we'll, no matter what, be able to continue these kinds of conversations. As far as my personal experience goes, on October 7th, Mkhaimar mentioned, and as did Jeff, Kibbutz Nir Oz, which, yes, is about 12, roughly as the bird flies, about 12 miles from the center of Gaza City. More importantly, for the purposes of this talk, my home was a little under a mile from the fence with Gaza, the border fence with Gaza. And on October 7th, and I'm sure the audience is aware, the entire southern border of Israel was assaulted by members of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. 1,400 deaths and 254 hostages taken. of, by the way, 24 nationalities, not just Israelis, but of course, the vast majority of them being Israelis. As far as our kibbutz is concerned, we turned out to be, by tragic circumstance, ground zero for the destruction. My son was among 74 hostages from our small community, a small cooperative farming community of about 400 people. 74 were taken hostage. Um, Several dozen were murdered that day in Nir Oz, and the community itself was physically destroyed and rendered uninhabitable, both by the terrorists who assaulted the kibbutz and massacred, but also by civilian looters. And this is one of the more troubling parts of October 7th for me, that wherever terrorists were able to breach into communities, they were followed very closely by civilian, mostly unarmed looters who came into these same communities and participated in all manner of destruction. I myself was not physically present on Nir Oz that morning. Had I been there, I would not be speaking with you now. I have no doubt whatsoever. My son at the time was 35 years old, taken hostage. Um, about 14 of those who were taken hostage from Nir Oz were subsequently murdered, or died from friendly fire during the course of their captivity. So our home, our kibbutz home, the place I've called home, more or less for 45 years, no longer exists, and it will have to be rebuilt at some point in the future. Up until October 7th, Jeff, of course, has kindly mentioned some of the things I've done as a scholar, but I didn't start my life as a scholar. I started my life actually as a kind of normal kibbutznik. So while I do write books and articles and things like that, my first love, and my wife is aware of this, are actually tractors and agricultural machinery, which is what I did for the first part of my adult life, is service those machines. But more importantly, as strange as it might sound to some of you, the spearhead of the Israeli peace movement certainly since the 1950s, the spearhead of the Israeli peace movement in all of its generations has been the kibbutz movement. And certainly since the 1980s, the tip of that spearhead has been from among the membership of the kibbutzim along the border with Gaza. And Nir Oz was no exception at all, nor was I an exception. Since I first arrived, sort of landed in Israel from a small town in Connecticut, I immediately found myself a part of that peace movement, in various stages, to get Israel, to extricate Israel from Lebanon during the first Lebanon War, then doing what we could to force Israeli governments to come to some kind of negotiated agreement with the Palestinians, and so on and so on. So for us, and kind of ironically, the reason that I'm here today and really have, I don't know if I have high hopes, but I know it's an absolute necessity, is precisely because of my individual crisis, having been a peacenik my entire life in Israel, alongside other things, but a peacenik at heart. How do I make sense of the past, present, and especially future, when our neighbors from the neighboring villages just in front, a mile to a mile and a half from Nir Oz, who we had been working towards peaceful coexistence with as we could as civilians, as citizens, on October 7th, many, not all, of course not, but many of them came to destroy when the opportunity presented itself. And I guess I hit, as a person, I hit rock bottom upon understanding that. And ever since, I've been looking for myself for a way to reestablish hope. Because one thing I do know is that Mkhaimar and myself, we want something different for our children and our grandchildren. We don't want to bequeath them the tragedies, the suffering that all the generations, even before 1948, to be honest, of this conflict, just the tears that the conflict has reaped. And there must be another way. What we've tried until now, working through sort of the standard conventional political system, it's not working, up to and including this moment.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. Mkhaimar, Jonathan spoke a little bit about his childhood and about growing up on the kibbutz. Maybe if you can tell us a little bit before we even get to the present, a little bit about your childhood and about what you remember about growing up in Gaza before the current destruction.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I was born and raised in Gaza. I was born in the Jabalia refugee camp. It's the largest refugee. It used to be the largest refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. It doesn't exist anymore now after the war on Gaza. Much of the refugee camp has been very much destroyed, as much as most of the Gaza Strip. I went to UNRWA primary schools in the late early 1970s. That's where I attended primary school, and then after I finished my high school, I went to Birzeit University in Ramallah in the West Bank, where I studied at Birzeit University history and political science. And right after my graduation from Birzeit University, the first Palestinian Intifada erupted. I lived the first year and a half of the first Palestinian Intifada with very much not doing anything. And at that point, it was when I decided that I wanted to pursue my graduate studies, and I succeeded in getting to the U.S. To do my graduate studies in political science. I was raised in a very extended family, again in the Jabalia refugee camp, and at one point we evacuated the refugee camp and went to live in a nearby town, which is Beit Lahia. That's where I spent most of my life years in Beit Lahia. And unfortunately, the home also where we grew up with my siblings was very much destroyed also during the 2 years war between October 7 on 2023 and until October 10th of 2025. We very much, I still have brothers and sisters who very much are displaced in the Gaza Strip. They live in tents. Most of them, they live in tents. Some of them are still in the middle part of the Gaza Strip, Deir al-Balah and the Mawasi of Khan Yunis. None of them is able to go back to the home, to our home where we were born and grew up in Beit Lahia, most of us. I have to say that it's very much an average Palestinian life, or an average Palestinian family, where I think your audience should be alerted that 2/3 of the Palestinians, of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, or even more than 2 million Palestinians, are refugees and descendants of Palestinian refugees who became refugees as a result of the Palestinian Nakba, or Palestinian catastrophe in 1948. Let me say that, personally speaking, I have been very much dedicated to peace between both Palestinians and Israelis. I've been participating in many conferences, workshops, and even track 2 negotiations to try to find a formula for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked yet. I have to say that one of the things that pushed me or encouraged me to go back to the Gaza Strip in the summer of 1997, after I finished my PhD at the University of Missouri, Columbia, It was about 3 years after this, 4 years after the signing of the Oslo agreement between the government of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, and also 3 years after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which is a Palestinian self-rule government that was in charge of the Gaza Strip and part of the West Bank at that time. There were a lot of hopes at that time in the late 1990s that finally peace is around the corner between the Palestinian and Israelis. But unfortunately, it was about 3 years after that when the Palestinian Second Intifada erupted, and the whole thing just collapsed at that point.
So let me turn to the Oslo process for a minute. I remember that time very well as well. I was living in Washington, D.C. I actually remember the day of the signing of the Oslo Accords. I was on my bike and was biking by the White House, could see the crowds, kind of just stood around, as close as I could get just to, watch the crowds. And I heard, the sudden eruption of applause, which I presume was the moment of that handshake. And, I too, as a foreigner living in, a Canadian living in the United States, recall as a greatly hopeful time. Do you think, and maybe I'll ask this to both of you, but starting with Mkhaimar, do you think that the outlines of that process was a possibility? Is it just circumstances that derailed it? Can we go back at some point in time to some type of process along those lines, or is that simply no longer a possibility?
Well, let me say that it was a historic agreement between Israel and the PLO at that time. Let's not forget that before the signing of the Oslo Agreement, the PLO was designated as a terrorist organization, and Israel would not even negotiate with the PLO. And originally it was secret back channel talks in Norway that were held between the Labour government led by the late Yitzhak Rabin, and also late Shimon Peres, and also late chairman of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and his associates. Again, it was a very historic moment that when both parties would not talk to each other, they were hosted in the lawn of the White House, where they signed the Oslo Agreement. And yes, Oslo was not perfect. The Oslo Agreement was not supposed to put an end to the conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis at that point. It was more of a confidence building measure agreement that supposedly confidence building will be built up between the Palestinians and Israelis that will lead at the end of the day to an end to the conflict and reach a final peace. Now, for the PLO and the Palestinians, Oslo meant at the end of the day that there will be an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land, mainly speaking of West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, or 1967 territory that was occupied by Israel on June 5th of 1967. But for Israel, it wasn't really clear. Let me remind you and remind Jonathan that I still recall that what late Prime Minister Rabin said, that the end game will be less than a state and more than autonomy. He didn't really have in mind what's going to be the end game for the Palestinians. But anyway, it was something that put the Palestinians and the Israelis on track. But unfortunately, I have to say that it was extremist on both sides. It was the extremists on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side who sabotaged Oslo. Let me remind you that it was a Jewish extremist who assassinated the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and also that led a few months later to the election of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it was also on the Palestinian side that they were extremists on the Palestinian side, mainly Hamas and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who vowed from the beginning to sabotage and kill the Oslo Agreement because they thought that Oslo was a sellout to Israel. Unfortunately, we both, Palestinians and Israelis, fell in the trap of extremists and radicals that basically put us in the position we are in right now.
Yeah. And Jonathan, I'll turn the same question to you. Do you think that the Oslo Camp David framework still has any relevance today as we think about peace processes one day, the possibility of renewing a peace process?
Well, one day certainly. I guess I'm going to respond at a number of different levels. If we take it just for the moment, right now, a few months ago, I was asked to speak at a J Street event, and those of you who may not be familiar with J Street, it's a pro-Israel lobby based in DC, but that it really embraces sort of more of the peace and coexistence movement and is not tied to this or that Israeli government in ways that AIPAC would be. And so, certainly a leftist orientation in Israeli terms. And one of the things that I told them that they didn't appreciate was that, at least for the foreseeable future, in their work with Israelis to stop talking about the two-state solution. After October 7th, there is no Israeli, or almost no Israeli of any consequence, who will be open to talking about that. So one could say, well, that ends the entire conversation, but I don't quite see it that way. And now I have to go backwards in order to perhaps go forwards. For us on Nir Oz, this is starting in 1993 and up to 1996. So, of course, up to 1996, and I'll explain that what happens and Mkhaimar began, but I think we need to sharpen that a little bit. It was a time of euphoria on the kibbutz and all along the border with Gaza. All of the communities felt this. Yes, there were some risks involved, no question, for Israel, because we didn't really know what we would get in terms of any kind of governance, Palestinian governments in Gaza. And for us, Gaza is not an abstraction. You walk out your front door and Gaza's right there, with nearly 2 million inhabitants. Nonetheless, we began a process on Nir Oz of meetings, both on our kibbutz and also inside of Gaza, with civilians in the two towns that are right across the border with us to interact on a person-to-person basis. Never really been done in that way before, because it had always been much more of a conflict zone. And I was absolutely blown over by the potential of what might be possible with these people, these moms and dads, mostly dads. Women, at least from the Palestinian side, were much less likely to participate in these meetings for more traditional reasons. But it gave me enormous hope. And Chaimar's correct. Even in our very sort of micro version of the Oslo honeymoon, we'll call it 93 to 96, what destroyed it was extremists. I think many things can be true at once. Had Yitzhak Rabin not been murdered by anyone, but certainly by a Jewish extremist, in fact, the Oslo process could have continued. And we would have gotten much further along. Why? Because he had the moral courage to do it. That simple. There is no other way to describe it. And had Benjamin Netanyahu not been elected in 1996, he instigated in September of 1996 the end of the Oslo process by sanctioning tunnel digging in the old city. It's an old story, but I knew I was sitting, sounds, it can't be true, but it is. I knew that Oslo was over. One day in September of 1996, I was sitting on top of a peanut combine in our fields in Nir Oz, just across the border from Gaza, and we saw Khan Yunis going up in flames from protests, the anger that provocation elicited. And I knew Oslo was over. Nobody had to tell me. I knew it was over. So I still believe, I have to believe, maybe a little naively, that the spirit still exists of the coexistence that Oslo seemed to carry. Our problem, our collective problem, is a lack of courage in our leadership. That is not going to change. Israeli elections will be coming up shortly. Trust me, there are no courageous, morally courageous leaders coming up for a vote, to the best of my knowledge. Hence, we need another solution or another pathway that doesn't depend on sort of conventional political processes. Who's going to replace Abu Mazen eventually? That can't be the solution. There has to be something else.
Yeah. And of course, the leaders have Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power for 18 years, I believe, and Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank and the Palestinian territories in the West Bank for 21 years, and Hamas in power in Gaza for 19 years. So, yeah, let's talk about leadership and the possibility of new leadership or a new way of leading emerging, because both of you raised that and raised the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin as a major turning point in the courage that was required in the Oslo Accords and signing the Oslo Accords, both of Rabin and Arafat for that matter. Mkhaimar, I'm wondering if you can talk about leadership and potential future leadership, particularly Palestinian future leadership, that can bring about a better future.
Well, Jeff, let me just first say that I totally agree with Jonathan that had the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was not murdered on November 5th, I believe, in 1995, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would have been probably resolved in a much better way. Yes, leadership does matter, and I think, as Jonathan just said, that the late Prime Minister Rabin had the courage and the morale to go with the peace process with the Palestinians, and also Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO at that time, was the only Palestinian leader who was capable of making peace with the Israelis. He started as a freedom fighter. He very much was succeeded in getting legitimacy from the Palestinian people and also from other Palestinian factions throughout the early years of the conflict and after the establishment of the Fatah movement, which he chaired, and also the PLO in the mid-1960s. Now, yes, President Mahmoud Abbas, who succeeded Chairman Arafat after the death of Yasser Arafat in November 2004, and I have to say that probably President Mahmoud Abbas is much more dedicated to making peace with Israel, and he has invested most of his life, even before becoming a president of the Palestinian Authority or a chairman of the PLO, he was known among the Palestinian factions and the Palestinian people that he was pro-peace. And he was, by the way, he was what we call him the architect of the Oslo Agreement. Yes, Chairman Arafat is the one who was leading the PLO, but President Mahmoud Abbas at that time was the architect of the Oslo Agreement. I think there are so many things that we probably do not have the time to go into why the whole peace process has failed. As I mentioned earlier, it is extremist, definitely extremist on both sides, sabotaged this process and pushed it to be a failed one. But I have to also say that maybe after the start of the Palestinian Second Intifada, what we call it Al-Aqsa Intifada, which erupted on September of 29, I think, the year 2000, and it was a very violent intifada that basically pushed the Israelis to the right, that led to the election of Prime Minister Netanyahu, election after election. And to the best of my knowledge, he has become the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel since the establishment of Israel in 1948. And probably if he gets elected, I don't know, probably Jonathan will answer this in a much better way than me. He probably will be the only prime minister in Western democracies that he has held this position for a long time. But anyway, let me go from this point and say something that, look, Jeff, this conflict has been at least going on for 78 years now. Maybe if we want to go to Rashid Khaldi has spoken about this, that it's a 100-year conflict when he published his book I think in the year 2023. 2017, I'm sorry, dating back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Again, this conflict has been going on for a long time between the Palestinians and Israelis. I have to say that after so many years of conflict, death, and destruction, it seems to me that there is no military solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Israel has exhausted probably almost every tool in its inventory to try to crush the Palestinians or to try to crush their political aspirations, but I don't think that Israel has succeeded yet in liquidating the political aspirations of the Palestinians. In the meantime, Palestinian resistance has failed to put an end to the Israeli occupation and establish a Palestinian independent state on the 1967 borders, which means that there is no military solution to this conflict. Both Palestinians and Israelis, at the end of the day, they have to come to sit on the table and to try to reach out an agreement that would basically provide Israel with security and also provide the Palestinians with peace and freedom. And without that, this conflict will just go on and on. And one fact that we have to take into consideration right now, that there are 7 million Palestinians live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, as much as also 7 million Israeli Jews who live on the same piece of land. And it doesn't seem to me that neither one of them is able to defeat the other. At the end of the day, both Palestinians and Israelis, the 7 million Palestinians who live between the river and the sea, and the 7 million Israeli Jews will have to come to an agreement. And to the best of my knowledge, the only game in the town, or the only solution on the table, is the two-state solution, which will provide Israel with security and provide the security and peace, and also will provide the Palestinians with peace and dignity and freedom. Without that, it seems to me that if it's going to be if we're going to leave it up to extremists, both on the Israeli side with settler violence, with the extremists, and also on the Palestinian side, it seems to me that if we continue with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we will end up blinds and teethless. And there has to be a rational person on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, to come and say, stop it. We have to come up with a solution. And I think maybe there is a little light at the end of the tunnel with the so-called President Trump 20 points plan, point number 19 and point number 20, which he speaks about Palestinian self-determination and statehood after rebuilding and reconstruction of Gaza, and also reforming the Palestinian Authority. Hopefully, maybe one day there will be an end to this conflict, and there will be peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis.
Yes, I think we can all hope so. Let me remind the audience here that there's also the possibility in the Q&A to ask questions and to encourage them to put in questions to the Q&A. Those questions will come to me, and I can moderate them and ask from those questions as they arise. I'll maybe take you up on the 20-point Gaza peace plan and the Board of Peace that President Trump instituted. We had Shai Feldman here, who's a professor of Israeli politics at Brandeis University, together with Khalil Shikaki a few months ago. And they spoke about October 7th as a possible inflection point, as an opportunity to remake Israel and Gaza and the Palestinian territories, perhaps in a positive way. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how things have changed on the ground for you, and what prospects you see for the 20-point plan in greater detail. So, Jonathan, uh, really how things
Um,
have changed on the ground since your son, but let's say since Sagui's release, even how things have changed for you.
Well, there, in the most simple of ways, there's since his return, shortly thereafter, there's some sunlight in my world and some oxygen in the air. It's a horrible thing to have a loved one taken hostage, period. But to be a hostage of a murderous terrorist organization where you know nothing about his fate was, a kind of torture, nothing to compare to what he experienced, yet tortuous nonetheless. And for us, it was multiplied by 74 because, again, in our small, very interconnected community, we had our 74 hostages. For us, we are the survivors from Nir Oz. We are, in fact, refugees in Israel, in our own country, because our homes, our communities, were destroyed. And so we are in temporary housing. It's not a refugee camp, it's a perfectly decent town in Israel, but it's very much not our place. And we have
Where
yet
are
to
you? What town are you in?
we are in, we on our own, with our own energy, the Israeli government did nothing to help us do this. We were evacuated immediately on October 8th
Hmm.
from the kibbutz in the middle of a war, really, down to evacuation hotels in Eilat. For those of you who don't know, it's the southernmost tip of Israel, was considered a safe zone until the Houthis started firing missiles and suicide drones at Eilat as well. But we set about the surviving community to find a place to live, in a transitional state. And so we are living in a small town called Kiryat Gat, where we were able to, it's roughly between Beersheba and Jerusalem, where we were able to access a little over 100 apartments for all of our families. And so we have been here for a year and a half when we'll be here. No, I'm sorry, 2 years, and we'll be here probably at least for another 2 years. Um,
And we as the whole kibbutz or other
it's
members of
it's
your
most
community?
of the survive. It's the vast majority of the surviving community. Yeah,
Mhm.
the only people who sort of peeled off in mass were the older members, the sort of the founding generation of members, those who survived October 7th. There was no way to be able to really take care of them here, so they almost immediately went into together, of course, because kibbutzniks remain kibbutzniks, into an assisted living facility in the Tel Aviv area. Um, as far as your question is concerned, I think there are two things that we have to, or one thing that we have to account for, and the other is like a sign, a glimmer of hope. The one thing we have to account for before there's any, and I agree completely with Mkhaimar, there is no military solution here. There simply is not. We've proven it time and again. The Israeli governments, not just Netanyahu, other governments, but especially his governments, may be very good at tactically trying to, there are all sorts of terms for this, contain, deter, mow the grass, whatever, with these immense tactical accomplishments. But there's absolutely no strategy for a better future. Um, and politically speaking, tragically, um, the best situation for extremists on both sides is perpetual war. And it allows them to do what they do and to retain control and manipulation over civilian populations.
Mhm.
So it seems to me that in a much more of a bottom-up sort of way, with like-minded people from across borders, from across belief systems, to start through conversations, smaller and then building up, to diffusing hate first, diffusing hate before we even begin to think about what the details of this or that negotiated agreement might be. We have to figure out that mechanism. And it is never, in the Middle East, it is never going to be top down. Because from top down, what do we get? These fantasies that have been very present in Israeli policymaking for decades now, and very recently in the United States, more recently in the United States, this idea of regime change. The way that we create peace in the Middle East is somehow magically, fantastically replacing regimes in Arab countries or in Persian countries, what have you. That's a non-starter. A, it doesn't work. And as we've seen repeatedly, no matter what you do. And secondly, it perpetuates war precisely because you can't really attain it. In the course of my advocacy work for the hostages, over the course of 2 years roughly, because I continued for the many months after Sagui was released, to campaign for the rest of the hostages who were still in Gaza, many of them from my kibbutz. And one of the most remarkable things I experienced with the help of some organizations and, well, big-hearted individuals were interfaith meetings with Christian leaders of many different denominations and, probably more importantly, Muslim leaders. These were all quiet and modest, no cameras. And of course, ostensibly, we were talking about the hostages and how important it was for everyone to get, to get the hostages home. I believe that a real step forward is kind of a roundabout politics through faith leaders and denominational leaders. And one of the even more encouraging things, and here I can drop names, as you mentioned in your opening, most of my advocacy work, just to be efficient, was with the presidential administrations, first Biden and then the Trump administration. But another branch of it was advocacy on Capitol Hill to keep pressure on the administrations. And the two most remarkable meetings, I met with hundreds of congresspeople on the Hill, and the two most powerful meetings were with the most unlikely of people. And this may surprise even people in your audience. One of them, both of them are proximate to you, is Rashida Tlaib and Ilan Omar. People who are identified, and perhaps even self-identify, as opponents of the Israeli government, justifiably or not, but yet at the most human level, those were remarkable meetings, repeatedly remarkable meetings. Mm-hmm. Whereas some of the loudest proponents from both sides of the aisle, the loudest proponents of support for Israel, were completely absent for us and resistant to our calls. So all this leads me to believe that A, we have to go another way and not just rely on the conventional political process because it's unlikely to bring us to that promised land. But also there is real potential through circumventing, in a way, that political system on both sides and through more human contacts. And I know it sounds pie in the sky, but I've seen it work in the most sensitive of issues, at the most volatile of times. So it gives me some measure of optimism.
Yeah, I think I'll say I share that optimism in the possibilities of dialogue across difference. In part, that's what this institute is all about and what we're trying to do here at the university and in this conversation, and also of grassroots action. And it comes about full pessimism in our leaders and just a complete failure of global leadership on so many levels that has led it to individuals to try to do what they can to make a difference. So I share those sentiments. There's a bunch of questions that are coming in from the audience, and maybe I want to get to some of those. And I'll start with a question from one of the students in the class. We have a class that is attending these. We've had several dialogues. We have a class that attends all of them. And one question I've got is, what is the role of civilian society in advancing peace in the region? How does this differ from political intervention, and what gaps could they fill in? Please touch on both local, regional, and international action. And Jonathan, you kind of touched on that a little bit in your answer already, so I'll turn that to Mkhaimar, and maybe if you can talk a little bit about civil society and their role.
Well, that's a very good question, Jeff. Let me say that in the Palestinian society, unfortunately, yes, civil society is very active in let's say in the field of advocating for democracy, human rights, rule of law, women rights, children rights. But I have to say that the Palestinian civil society hasn't been very active in the promotion of peace. Very much Palestinian civil society stick to international law, international humanitarian law, and a big portion of Palestinian civil society is what we call it anti-normalization with Israel, and they very much see any contact between Palestinian and Israelis as part of the so-called normalization, which is not accepted by Palestinian civil society. So peace. Let's say the peace process was very much left at the top level, at the so-called leaders level, mainly the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian factions. But again, at the civil society level, that yes, there are some Palestinian, let's say, personalities who have been advocating for peace, but it isn't done in the name of Palestinian civil society. It was much of it was done at the personal level. Now let me here. I think I have to differentiate between probably two periods. During those years, Jonathan spoke about. Right after the establishment of the signing of the Oslo Agreement and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994, there were cross-border meetings between Palestinians and Israelis. Still, the peace camp in Israel was very active, very big, very influential in Israel. Based on my research in the mid-1990s, roughly or more than 80% of the Palestinians believed in the Oslo process, in the peace negotiations between the PLO and Israel back then, between mid-1990s all the way until the eruption of the Palestinian Second Intifada. And at that time, cross-border talks or cross-border meeting between Palestinians and Israelis, and even Palestinian civil society was involved in that, because again, back then, the Palestinian thought that the Oslo, at the end of the day, will put an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land and the establishment of a Palestinian independent and sovereign state. But unfortunately, it was after the eruption of the Palestinian Second Intifada and the rise of the so-called Israeli right and the diminishing of peace hopes between Palestinians and Israelis, that let's say civil contacts at civil society level became not the norm. Let's say after the Second Palestinian Intifada. But again, at the personal level, I know that there are many Palestinian personalities who are involved in what we call it track two negotiations. And very much believe in what I have been talking about, that at the end of the day, there has to be this Palestinian-Israeli conflict will be settled through peace negotiations, and it won't be settled by military means. After 78 years of conflict, there is no military solution to this conflict. Now, again, I think maybe one last point here. I think after Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdul Aziz of Saudi Arabia in 2002, after they unleashed the Arab Peace Initiative, which was not very much welcomed, but let's say by the Israeli governments or by the Israeli right, that's when became that many Palestinians lost hope or lost, let's say, the energy to go on with contacts with Israelis. But yes, still there are many Palestinians who are dedicated to meeting and talking to Israelis, hoping that one day that there will be a peace between both Palestinians and Israelis.
Thanks. And Mkhaimar, let me stick with you for a minute and ask, Jonathan spoke about relationships among his community, among Kibbutz Nir Oz and where they're living now. I wonder if you can talk about the contact that you've managed to maintain with your community back in Gaza. Who is there? Are you living now in Cairo with a bunch of people from your own community? What sort of possibility of re-engaging civil society, re-engaging your community is there now?
I have to say that I have to say that I have to be honest with you, Jeff and Jonathan. After 2.5 years of war and destruction, we are talking here that more than 72,000 Palestinians have lost their lives. Most of those who have been killed in the past 2.5 years are most of them are Palestinian children and Palestinian women, mainly civilians who have nothing to do with the conflict. We're talking about 172,000 Palestinians have been injured. We're talking about more than 80% of the Gaza Strip has been very much destroyed. Most people live in displaced tents. Food has become a scarcity. So it isn't, I have to say that maybe you are not gonna see or you are not gonna hear vocal voices in Gaza advocating peace right now. And coming to this event with Jonathan, I have to say that it hasn't been easy for me. And one thing, but I have to say that I took the risk of coming, even though I was alerted not to do so. Still, let's say that emotions are very high. What's going on in Gaza right now? Still, the situation is very complicated. Even though there has been a ceasefire for about 6 months now, since October 11th of 2025 until now, it's been 6 months that there is a ceasefire. But let me say that more than 750 Palestinians have been killed over the past only 6 months since the ceasefire has come to place. There are still no mobile homes have been allowed into Gaza. According to the World Health Organization, roughly there are 20,000 Palestinian sick and injured Palestinians who need to be treated outside of Gaza, and some of them are basically dying as a result of not being able to get medical treatment outside of Gaza. So I have to say that honestly, this is not a permissible thing even to talk about among the Palestinians in Gaza. And I don't know how much the situation in the West Bank, but also with settler violence, with the current Israeli government and army protecting, unfortunately, settler violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. I have to say that it isn't easy to advocate or to speak up and to push for let's say civilian to civilian contacts or people to people contacts on both. If there were, let's say, official talks between the government of Israel and the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, that would make it even much easier for cross-border talks and cross-border meetings. But since there are no official dialogue or no official negotiations between the two leadership, it becomes much more difficult to digest or to push for such, as I mentioned, cross-border talks or meetings.
Yeah, I can imagine.
If that's what you meant, I hope that I understood your question correctly, Jeff, here.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I can imagine how difficult it is. We, even here in America, have and on campus have a great deal of difficulty having conversations across differences on this topic. I can imagine how difficult it is to have this type of conversation for those of you who are there right now. There's another question that you may have answered in part just now, asking what is the status of rebuilding food delivery, medical care to people in Gaza? Are there any positive or negative changes over the past few months? You answered a little bit. Maybe if you can expand on that.
Well, yeah, that is definitely another good question, Jeff. Let me say that there were a lot of hopes in mid-January when President Donald Trump declared the establishment of the so-called Board of Peace and also the establishment of the NCAG, which is the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. A Palestinian Technocratic Committee was established in mid-January that will replace the Hamas government, who is in charge of the Gaza Strip, as you mentioned earlier, for the past 19 years. But unfortunately, the eruption of war between U.S., Israel, and Iran suspended, let's say, any push for let's say, alleviating the daily life conditions in the Gaza Strip. Still, the situation is as bad as it was before the ceasefire. Yes, maybe more food has been allowed, but not enough to the point where it is accessible to every single Palestinian. I still talk to my brothers and siblings in Gaza. Prices are very high. Not everything can find it in the market. As I mentioned earlier, there are many sick and injured people who are not able to get out of Gaza, and hopes that the NCAG, or the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, will be allowed to go back to Gaza and replace Hamas. It has become also a very depressing thing for the Palestinians in Gaza, and also even for the committee itself, which has been around for about 2.5 months now without being able to go back to the Gaza Strip. There are even rumors on Palestinian social media that this Palestinian Technocratic Committee is about to put a collective, how do you say it, resignation to Miladinov, who is the High Commissioner of the Executive Committee of the Board of Peace, because they basically feel that they haven't done anything since this committee has come to life. So the situation is still unbearable, and I think with the war in Iran, basically Gaza was neglected and became and was let me put it, it was put on the so-called back burner of the region problems.
Yeah, and I can imagine how frustrating it must be to be trying to provide aid, to be trying to work for the Technocratic Commission, to be trying to better things and be confronted with yet another war. Let me read a question for Jonathan. You alluded to this earlier. This is the question. You alluded to this earlier, but how can you, or have you, reconciled in your mind the fact that many of the same Palestinians who you worked with were the same ones who literally massacred your fellow kibbutzniks, destroyed your kibbutz, and took your son hostage? It seems to me irreconcilable. If you can respond to that, Jonathan.
You know, that's a very heavy question, of course. The answer that I have for myself, that may or may not work for other people, is that that is the result of cultures of hate, simply cultures of hate. And while we can spend, as scholars, as citizens of the world, of the region, we can certainly spend a lot of time and energy re-adjudicating the past, how we got here. Where did the hate come from? I'm sure there's blame to be spread all around. And while we can also, even now, debate about the levels of human suffering, of deaths and injuries that were sustained in Gaza as a result of this horrific war. Where do the numbers come from? We can debate that, but in the end, it doesn't matter. We can all agree that what has happened has been a catastrophe. It's been a catastrophe. If you go by, the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in Gaza, or just, some dead reckoning as to what the levels of destruction were. I think there are certain things that we know for sure now. As a result of October 7th, and also this war with Iran, that trying to ignore, making a conscious effort to ignore internationally, right, amongst leaders, both in Israel and also in the Arab world, and others, trying to ignore or circumvent the Palestinian issue will just bring more suffering.
Mhm.
There's a theory out there that I think is much more than a theory, that one of the primary causes for October 7th was the Abraham Accords, which in fact essentially erased the Palestinian issue. There's an argument to be made right now, and I think, Mkhaimar, I don't know if you personally were trying to make the argument, but I think the argument can be made, that the rush to attack Iran, amongst other things, also made it possible to put the reconstruction of Gaza, which is extremely complicated no matter what, on the way, way back burner so that nobody will be talking about it in the international community. And all of that is tragic. One of your students in an earlier question, and I just want to, if you'll allow me, to go back to that question of, well, what can, given the horrific conditions that Mkhaimar, that we agree on, and the desperation of civilians in Gaza, well, what can be done to somehow, through civil society, get to a better place with mutual suspicions and hatreds? Well, I think we need help. I doubt that Mkhaimar and I could have what I think is a constructive conversation that would have an audience at all if it was just me and Mkhaimar. You've convened us. I don't know how many people are watching now or how many people will see the recordings, but it amplifies our message through convening. I would like to believe, in terms of moving forward, that those bodies, countries, bodies, agencies that are that have committed themselves to the reconstruction of Gaza. We'll put the West Bank aside for a moment. I think it's a very different issue, or substantially different. If part of their agenda, if we as a whole could convince that part of their agenda is convening, that would be a part of reconstructing Gaza, is a kind of convening, not necessarily for wise talk. I am convinced, for example, that if these conveners, these people in the executive board, were to ask for Israelis and that they could be protected to come and help reconstruct Gaza with their own hands, I can imagine that there'd be a long line of Israelis willing to do that. What kind of effect would that? That would be a civil society move. Risky in all sorts of ways, risky. But again, I think your student demands an answer. And again, this is creative, this is hopeful. Who knows where any of this is going? But it's not that complicated. It really isn't. It's about will, and it's about, and this I learned from the advocacy efforts all around the world. It's about ground up empowerment and the willingness to mobilize. It makes a huge difference. And here as well, I think it could, but we have huge problems to confront. There's no questions, and huge obstacles that are mostly political, failures of leadership.
Yeah, well, you mentioned on that topic, the Wallenberg Institute here is about 16 months old. Our very first program that we did was on the topic of can one person make a difference? And I think the conclusion was, one person can sometimes make a difference, but really it's coalitions of people working together, and particularly small coalitions of people working together that can make a difference. I think you're both right in that this is what applies here. Let me read another question from another one of our students. We have some really fantastic students here who are interested in this and interested in making a difference themselves. And the question is the United States the best mediator for this conflict? It seems to me that the intentions of our current administration are not to build peace in the region, but to profit from the war and even to develop land in Gaza. Is it gullible to believe in Trump's 20-point plan? Maybe let me go back to who is the best mediator? Is the United States still a viable mediator in the current conflict? Mkhaimar, I'll throw that to you first.
Well, very interesting question, Jeff. Let's say that since the start of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there have been many other mediators, and one of the most successful mediators were the Norwegian, who brokered the Oslo Agreement between the PLO and Israel in the early 1990s. Now, maybe in the eyes of the Palestinians, the United States of America is not the best mediator. The Palestinians very much see the U.S. as a biased mediator, basically siding with Israel. But let's agree that probably the U.S. administration and probably the current president of the U.S., President Donald Trump, is the only person who is capable, probably, to put pressure or enough pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government to proceed with peace with the Palestinians. We all know that how Israel has become suspicious of many European countries or any European intervention in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's obvious, it's not a secret anymore that Israel doesn't trust EU. Israel doesn't welcome any intervention from EU countries, and the only country who is trusted and accepted by Israel is the U.S. Now, again, to the Palestinians, yes, the U.S. isn't seen as an honest broker in this conflict, but probably again, the U.S. is the only country who can deliver peace between the Palestinians and Israelis, and that's what I alluded to earlier when I said maybe, hopefully, the 20-point plan by President Donald Trump, point number 19 and 20, that there is really a lot of hopes among the Palestinians that at one point there will be enough pressure, even though, by the way, Prime Minister Netanyahu posed his reservation on those two items, Palestinian self-determination and statehood. But maybe President Donald Trump has still another 2 years and 9 months. Maybe by the end of his term, there will be enough pressure from this current administration on Israel to implement the whole plan, the whole 20-point plan, which at the end of the day lead to Palestinian self-determination and peace between the Palestinians and Israelis.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Let me ask, since we're running low on time, let me get to another student question, because I do want to try to get to as many of them as I can, which is, I've heard a good amount about what the next step is likely to be, stop the violence, and interpretations of what we imagine a permanent solution may be, statehood. But I've not really heard or seen expressed what the intermediary steps look like between these. I'm curious what the speakers think the intermediary period, maybe 5 years, could look like between stopping the immediate violence and working towards some type of permanent solution. Jonathan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think the sine qua non here is reconstruction of Gaza. It has to happen. You can't, there simply is no way to approach someone who's living in, abject poverty and desperation in a tent in mud, in mud streets with outdoor latrines and expect that there will be any change for the better in their orientation towards Israel, probably anything else. So that is, without that, there's nothing. That's for sure. Um, I do think that it would be a kind of shame. It would be a waste of effort monumentally if that reconstruction, as I mentioned before, didn't have elements of a kind of rehabilitation, modest, slow, but a kind of reconstruction of rehumanizing, not dehumanizing, rehumanizing the other on both sides. It will be difficult, there's no question. And just being completely honest, the challenges on the Israeli side are not that much smaller than on the Palestinian side. No, we're not living in tents, open to the elements and wondering where our next meal is going to come from. But there is enormous amongst, sort of from side to side, enormous suspicion of who and what the Palestinians are at this point. So a lot of work needs to be done there as well. It won't work if it's just unilateral. Um, but during the 5, 6, 7 years that it will surely take, no matter how much money is dumped into the physical reconstruction of Gaza, that absolutely, if there's any hope at all, has to be accompanied by this rehumanization. And it's not just about changing the school books that Hamas was using. It has to work on both sides of the border.
We were talking in our class last week, and there's a question about this as well, which is, if you think a Truth and Reconciliation Committee could be an answer and could be a way of rehumanizing, of dealing with the past. Maybe Mkhaimar, I'll let you respond, and also to respond to the earlier question first.
Well, I wanted to say something with regard to the previous question.
Yeah, go ahead.
According to public opinion polls, which have been conducted on both sides of the borders, among the Israelis, among the Palestinians, it seems to me that the majority on both sides of the border, the majority of Israelis want peace, and also the majority of Palestinians want peace, especially after October 7 and what has happened, the death and the destruction and all of that has happened over the past 2.5 years. There definitely a majority, still a majority of on both sides, that they still hope for peace, want peace, but unfortunately, neither side trust the other side, or neither side believe that the other side want peace. It seems to me that after October 7, the Israelis believe that there is no partner on the other side, or they don't trust the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, anymore. Also, taking into consideration the death and the destruction which has been inflicted on Gaza, and also what's going on in the West Bank, that yes, the Palestinians want peace, but they don't trust the Israelis. They don't think that the current Israeli government is ready for peace, which means that that's where we need someone to intervene. A third party must intervene. A third party must put enough pressure on both sides to come to the table where there has to be a solution. I mean, it cannot be left up to the Palestinians and Israelis to go on with this killing, bloodshed, hate, incitement, you name it. Now, it seems to me that, yes, I do agree with Jonathan that there is a lot of hate that has been happening lately on both sides of the borders. Now, what do we need? I think leadership matters. I think what we really need, what we call it, role model leaders who can very much influence public opinion. I'm very much influenced by the role model of Rabin. You know, in the early 1990s, still that the Israelis did not think that there could be peace with the PLO. The PLO was still designated as a terrorist organization. But that's where leadership matters. Israeli public opinion was changed by the role model of Rabin. Same thing on the Palestinian side. I think and this is what we don't have now. Unfortunately, what we have now is leaders on both sides who aren't ready to sit down together and reach a compromise. And hopefully, the next generation of Palestinian and Israeli leaders will come together and put an end to this ongoing conflict. But I do think that, yes, maybe what we do need a culture of peace. We need to deal with hate, incitement, and all of that. But I do really think that what we really need also new leaders who can influence their public opinion on both sides.
I think that's absolutely what we need, and hope we can work towards that. Let me start to wrap up because we only have a couple minutes left. And I want to return to both of you personally. We've talked about the future of the Middle East and prospects for the future of the Middle East. What are your plans over the next few years? I know, and where do you plan on being now that your cities are, you can't return to your hometowns, your universities are, you can't immediately return to. I know, Jonathan, you've taken a new position at Columbia University. Maybe if you can tell us a little bit about your plans, and then I'll ask Mkhaimar the same. Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. I once Sagui came home and the last hostage returned to Israel in last January, um, I realized that I needed to engage in more significant ways around these ideas of peace building. I agree, of course, with Mkhaimar about leadership. It would be great if, new leaders can be born. I don't think we can wait that long. I think we have a social and moral responsibilities just to our own communities to do what we can now, in lieu of morally courageous leaders, or at least non-corrupt leaders. Um, so, therefore, it's one of the big reasons that I decided to take this position at Columbia, at the School of International and Public Affairs. Not so much as a straightforward scholar, which I will continue to do, but also to use it as a platform to advance these ideas of non-state empowerment, or non-state diplomacy, so that, students like yours, if they don't want to go into government, will have a much better blueprint for how sort of normal people, we'll say non-elected people, um, can, based on my scholarship and also based on my personal experience over the last 2.5 years as a practitioner, how it is possible to certainly impact the direction of policy in certain ways. So that's where I'm headed, and will try to the degree that I can, relentlessly pursue that and write a book about that meeting ground between the study of non-state diplomacy and transnational advocacy in the theoretical and historical way that I've done it until now, but merge that with how I know now it actually can work, what works and what doesn't work, honestly, based on my own personal experience over the last couple of years.
Jonathan, that's a very ambitious project, and I'm very glad that you've taken it up. I think you're a fantastic person to do that, and look forward to seeing what you do at Columbia and what you do in the future in that direction. Mkhaimar, what about you? What are your plans for the next few years?
Well, I don't really have anything specific. So if you have any position for me, Jeff, at University of Michigan or the Raoul Wallenberg Center, I'm more than happy to come.
Mhm.
Uh, I am doing a number of things. I'm doing some research and some writings right now. I'm looking into different opportunities to go on with my research and scholarships. But I have to be honest with you, I'm not in a position to go back to Gaza at the current moment. It's a very devastated place. It's a very a traumatic place to be back right now. So one day, yes, I hope that I will be able to go back to Gaza, where I was born and where I was raised, and to get back with my family, friends, and relatives. But I think I will have to go on with my life at a different place at the current moment to try at least to be able to provide for myself and for my family.
Mhm. Well, I wish you the best and most success in that too, as well. And if there's much we can do to help, let us know. Uh, but again, this was a really wonderful conversation. I do regret that we couldn't bring you in person, introduce you to our students. I'm sure they would have enjoyed interacting with you and learning from you. I hope there will be another time that we can do that at some point in the future. But again, really appreciate your bravery in making this happen, your willingness to talk to each other, and your flexibility. I know it's past midnight for you right now in Jerusalem and near midnight in Cairo. So really appreciate the two of you having this conversation and wish you the best for the future. May we have a brighter future ahead of us in your part of the world and around the world and in our part of the world as well. So thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Good night.